Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we'll be covering the human nervous system, and this is lecture part 1, and so there's a part 2 as well. So for part 1 we'll be learning about the brain anatomy, and for part 2 we'll be learning about the individual cells that make up the nervous system. You can find this information in Concepts of Biology, so I have outlined the page numbers here for you. Now remember, when I'm referring to page numbers, I'm actually referring to the page numbers of the book, not the PDF numbers. You'll notice that the PDF numbers do not match the page numbers, and so make sure you are paying attention to the page numbers. Also, the majority of the information that I have gathered for these next 2 lectures come from Chapter 2, Julian's Drug Primer. So this is the required textbook for the course. And by now, you need this book, so make sure you have acquired it. If you have an older version, that's fine. But make sure that you have a copy of the book. And like I said, the majority of the information comes from the textbook and will be the case from now on. Also, there's information that you will find in the textbook that is not covered in my lectures. So whatever I don't cover in my lectures or in my study guides is not anything that you're responsible for. So if you find extra information in the textbook and you notice I didn't talk about it in my study guide or in my lecture, then you are not responsible for it. So you are only responsible for the information that I cover in my lectures and study guides. So I know I repeat myself a lot, but I just want to make sure that we are clear on that. Of course, you can email me if you have any questions. Don't hesitate to send an email or come to office hours. All right, so let's start off with the definition of psychoactive drugs. And so a psychoactive drug is a chemical substance that changes the nervous system function and results in alterations in perception, mood, consciousness, cognition, and behavior. And so psychoactive drugs can change our brain chemistry and cause us to act in ways that are not normal to our homeostasis. For example, like when an individual drinks alcohol, it impairs their coordination, their vision, their decision making. And so it's basically like hijacking the central nervous system and causing a person to do something that they normally wouldn't do. So this picture here just shows how certain drugs, especially the ones that are used chronically, can have a long-term effect on the brain. So not only does it alter our chemistry temporarily, but it can alter it long-term. And so this picture here shows the scan of a woman with alcoholism, and so this is a chronic user, in comparison to a scan of a woman without alcoholism. So if you notice in this brain scan here, it looks as though the brain has shrinked, meaning that the neurons, the brain cells, have died off. And so not only does it, affect an individual's, perception and consciousness, but it can also change the anatomy of the brain. And so, it can become very serious for chronic users. We have mentioned before in probably the first lecture about the types of drugs that we will cover in this class. And so there are depressants, and depressants tend to slow down the central nervous system. So your decision making is impaired, your speech is slurred, your heart rate goes down. It's more of a relaxing sensation. For example, like alcohol, barbiturates, and opiates are considered depressants. And then there are stimulants, which are the opposites of depressants, and that's more of an upper. And so that can raise your heartbeat. That activates the flight or flight response, and so it makes a person so the flight or fight response, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, is basically a response to danger. And so, for example, if let's say you're in a bar and you're about to get in a fight, I know it's a dumb example, but let's just say, and you have the option to do flight or fight. So you either will fight the person or you will run. Regardless, you need a lot of energy to do either or. And so what stimulants do is activate that flight or fight response. So it makes a person feel like they have to do something. And so it speeds up body functions. It basically makes neurons, fire faster, and neurons are your brain cells. And it activates more parts of the brain. It stimulates them. And so that's why it's called a stimulant. And some stimulants are caffeine, which is why people like drinking caffeine in the morning, helps wake them up. Nicotine, which is found in cigarettes, amphetamines, and cocaine. And then there are other classes of drugs, which are hallucinogens. And hallucinogens, they basically affect the body's senses, the body's five senses, your sense of smell, sight, touch, hearing, even emotional senses. And so hallucinogens tend to perpetuate those, so it can amplify those, and so people can see things that are not there, or they can have emotions that that are strong, or they can hear things that are not there and whatnot. And LSD is an example of hallucinogen. It's like the classical example, and so is psilocybin. And some other drugs like ecstasy can fall under hallucinogens just because of that intense emotional state. And also marijuana causes some people to have like different types of psychosis. Although marijuana can also be a stimulant or a depressant, depending on, the individual and the type of plant smoked. And so, these categories aren't set in stone. Drugs are just kind of categorized, but they can sometimes fall into other categories as well. So, in order to understand the actions of psychoactive drugs, it is necessary to have some idea of how the brain is organized, what a neuron is, and how neurons interact with each other. And so, once we understand the anatomy of the brain and we understand it on a whole level and also on an individual cell level, then we can understand how drugs, because drugs are molecules, affect the central nervous system. And so the central nervous system is basically our brain, spinal cord, and all of the neurons that connect to the rest of our body, which mediate thoughts, actions, memories, and behaviors. This is mostly from the central nervous system. And so all of your decision making, your problem solving, your knowing right from left, your sensation, reading, vision, color, all of those things that we use to interpret the world is all from the central nervous system. And so psychoactive drugs, which is, what we're going to cover for the rest of this semester, is basically are the drugs that affect these actions. Okay, so they affect the central nervous system. Now, the human nervous system is divided into two parts. It is divided into the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. So here in purple is the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system are basically all of the nerves that branch out to the rest of the body that originate from the spinal cord and connect to all parts of the body. And so the peripheral nervous system is responsible for mediating information from the body to the brain and from the brain to the body. And so, that's how the heart beats. That's how information is sent. Or let's say, if you touch something hot and you need to move from that area so that you don't, cause more intense pain, then that is sent, to your spinal cord to do the job, and you'll have a reflex to move. Or if you plan on, let's say, going for a jog, the information, starts from your brain and then coordinates muscle movement so that you can start going on a jog. So isn't it fascinating how, we have these abilities that we take for granted, but the fact that we have this whole network, from our brain communicating with our body and our body communicating to our brain to keep us alive is really just, a miracle in itself. Here's a picture of an actual brain. So just in case you've never seen one before, this is preserved. And so this is like, cut in half. So you're seeing it, let's see, from the midsection. So this is just split here. And you can see like the hippocampus here. You can see the midbrain, the cerebellum. Pretty cool. Here's a frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, temporal. So this is a picture of a brain just in case you've never seen one before. All right, let's talk about the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system. This is the information highway of the body. So it carries sensory information from the skin, muscles, joints, and internal body and organs to the brain. It modulates sensory input, so that includes pain impulses. In fact, whenever you have a reflex, have you ever heard of like the reflex on your knees? Like you can like kind of like hit someone on the knee and it'll cause their leg to jerk up. Well, your spinal cord regulates those reflexes. In fact, the information goes to your brain after. Same thing when you touch something hot. Your spinal cord is the first to respond with the reflex so that you can move away from it. And then your brain later processes the information as like, oh, I just touched something hot. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but like, have you noticed when you touch something hot and then you move away from it, and then like seconds later, then you start to feel the pain? That's because the information takes a little longer to reach the brain to understand what's going on. Um, and so the central nervous system, the spinal cord is also involved in the involuntary control of vital bodily functions. So and that includes your heart rate, digestive system, and whatnot. The brainstem is the part of the brain in which information, when it comes from the spinal cord or when it leaves from the brain to the spinal cord, needs to go through the brainstem first. And so it goes through the brainstem and then it is relayed to other parts of the brain. And so the brainstem, it consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, which are here: medulla, pons, midbrain. And like I said, all information from the brain and spinal cord pass through the brainstem. This is responsible for regulating vital bodily functions like respiration, blood pressure, heart rate, sleep, digestive system. And this is really just the main center for it. Also, and so it's not part of this, it's connected to the spinal cord, but it is not the spinal cord. This is just like the primitive brain. This is like the brain that we have in common with a lot of other organisms. And all of these structures out here is like the more evolved brain, like the higher primates have more of these structures up here. Anyway, so also is involved in regulating behavioral responses such as alerting, attention, and arousal. Depressant drugs, so drugs that are depressants, such as barbiturates, depress the brainstem, and so it can cause like a hypnotic action. Hypnotic meaning like sleepy, kind of not all there. You're kind of just like in a zone. So depressant drugs tend to target this area, well, and other areas too. The cerebellum is in the back of the brain. This is involved for posture and coordinating movements. And so ataxia is a term or like a technical term for the drunken state. And so when a person has a lot of alcohol, they'll lose the coordination. And that's why when a person gets pulled over and they're asked to do like, they're asked if they are drunk, and if the person claims that they are not, but yet, a police officer may not, believe that person, they're asked to do like a test where you have to walk a straight line. And so in a drunken state, the cerebellum is impaired. And so it's very hard for a person to walk in a straight line. They have lost their coordination because the cerebellum is involved in coordination. And again, alcohol affects this part of the brain. And this and other parts, of course, that we will talk about in another lecture. The nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area, short for VTA, are these are the really highly targeted brain structures for most drugs, especially addictive drugs. The reason being that both of these are part of what we call the reward pathway, which we'll talk about a little bit in this lecture, and then we'll talk about it again, once again. The reward pathway is basically several structures of your brain that are involved in releasing dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical that makes you feel happy. Okay? And so, for example, when you eat, you release dopamine because eating makes you happy. And we need to have this type of system. We need to have something this is like a positive reinforcement. We need this for our survival, because if we didn't like eating, we may forget to eat. we may go days skipping meals, and if we do that, we wouldn't be able to survive. And so there has to be positive reinforcements to cause us to repeat a behavior over and over again. And so the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area are the areas in the brain. So here it is, VTA, nucleus accumbens, which have neurons and neuronal projections that basically connect to other parts of the brain. So if you notice here, VTA has all of these projections here, which communicate to other parts of the brain and release dopamine. And it basically causes a person to remember what the behavior is and to repeat the behavior, to coordinate movement to get to that thing that caused a positive reinforcement. And so sex is another positive reinforcer, drinking water, and there are other things that tend to, make a person feel like they are feeling rewarded. Like, for example, we now in this generation kind of have like an addiction to social media and to our phones. Some people have an addiction to shopping, or when they go shopping, they feel really good. When, like I do, I love shopping. I don't think I have an addiction. I don't claim to, but I do totally have shopping therapy, where shopping just is fun. I like it. Some people feel a dopamine rush when they gamble. There's a lot of things that can, cause this feeling of reward. But again, the reason why we are designed with this feeling of reward is basically to cause us to repeat a behavior that will keep us alive, basically. However, drugs tend to hijack this, and so that's why they become very addictive. And so the nucleus accumbens is a reward-motivated learning, also involved in more motor coordination. Whenever you hear motor, that has to do with muscle movement, and this is like voluntary muscle movement. And the nucleus accumbens also has a connection to the limbic system, which we'll talk about in a few slides from now. And the limbic system is the emotional part of the brain, and so it communicates with the emotional parts of our brain that make us feel like good or sad or whatever, our emotions, we have various emotions. And ventral tegmental is the central part of the reward circuit pathway, and it has a bunch of dopamine neurons that project to several regions of the brain to release dopamine. And this is the main target for drug addiction, behavioral disorders, also motivation and locomotor activity. And so when a person loses motivation, it can be issues with the dopamine levels released. And some drugs cause people to, lose their motivation. And so really what they're doing is having a decline in dopamine. Well, that and many other things that can go on. Then you have the hypothalamus and thalamus. And so the hypothalamus, located here, still in the middle of the brain, and then hypothalamus right below it, is so hypothalamus is the vegetative functions such as eating, drinking, sleeping, regulation of body temperature, and sexual behavior. It's also responsible in secreting hormones to the pituitary gland, and it's also a target for psychoactive drugs, and especially where a person can have side effects, and so it can cause a person to feel sleepy or more hungry, or make them feel more cold, or change their sexual behavior. The thalamus is basically the relay station of the brain. Every sensory system passes through the thalamus except the olfactory. And so the information is then sent to the other parts of the brain. Psychostimulants such as methamphetamines alter behaviors basically related to the thalamus and hypothalamus. Well, quite a bit of drugs do, but I'm just giving you examples. And then we have the amygdala and the hippocampus. And I'm kind of just showing you in pairs just so that we can cover two brain structures in one slide. So it's not like the amygdala and the hippocampus do the same thing. It's just, me showing you each structure in one slide. And so the amygdala, this little structure here, is involved in emotional responses. And it also helps your brain store memories. And so that means that it talks back and forth with the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the main player in coordinating, not coordinating, but mostly recording memories and forming memories. So yeah, it's involved in memory and emotional responses, but mostly memory. And so if a person becomes addicted, they remember what the drug was and how they felt, and then they remember where they can acquire it and stuff like that. And so that's why the memory is involved. And so you can have short-term memory or working memory or long-term memory, where memories are stored. Now, the limbic system is basically a system of several brain structures that are all coordinated and involved in a person's emotions. And so the functions are to control emotions, produce feelings, interpret sensory impulses, and even facilitate in memory. Sorry if I mispronounce things. It's just a bad habit that I have. But anyway. And so the limbic system, is associated with several sections of the brain. And so portions of the frontal lobe are involved, portions of the temporal lobe, the hypothalamus, thalamus, basal nuclei, and other nuclei. So nuclei is just basically areas that with dense neurons that connect to other parts of the brain. And this is considered the motivational system. And so when a person doesn't feel very motivated, the limbic system is being affected. And so a lot of drugs can tend to cause people to lose their motivation. So just, a little closer look here. Limbic system involves the thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, all of these different brain structures. And it's a common target for psychoactive drugs that alter mood, emotion, or responses to emotional experiences. And basically drugs like medicinal drugs that are used in treatments of schizophrenia, depression, and Alzheimer's disease target the limbic system. So here's a brief overview of the reward circuit. I talked about the reward circuit earlier, and I said that these are parts of the brain that cause us to feel happy. And so this is a positive reinforcement. This is the reason why we repeat behaviors. And so the reward circuit includes the hippocampus. And so this is where a person forms memories. And so if they take a drug and they like it, they use the hippocampus to remember what that drug was and how to get it. The prefrontal cortex is involved as well because the prefrontal cortex is involved in planning. And so a person can plan on how to get that drug. The nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area are basically, they have dopamine releasing neurons, and they formulate connections with the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus so that a person can remember and plan on how to get the drug. And also these areas are what make the person feel good, so it gives you that feel good effect. And then the amygdala, we said that is part of the brain that affects the emotions. And so a person can feel happy, let's say if you eat a piece of cake and you're like, that tastes good, that, affects your emotions. All right, so coming down to the last parts of the brain anatomy, let's now just split it into 4. Maybe you've already learned this before. And so it's split into the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. And so we're going to talk about these 4 brain structures. And so the frontal lobe is located in the front of the brain, so just right above your eyes. It's involved in problem solving, reasoning, speech, and voluntary motor control. So voluntary motor control is basically voluntary muscle movement. And so if you purposefully want to go for a run, you can do that with your voluntary muscle movements. And you can plan things, and so and it's also involved in your consciousness and even impulsivities too. So it can keep you from doing impulsive things. So drug abuse alters cognitive activities such as decision making and inhibition, and so it makes a person more impulsive, and it also can affect the decisions that they make. And it's likely setting the stage for addiction and relapse. And so, the frontal lobe is heavily activated in drug addiction. Or not activated, but more like hijacked. The parietal lobe, which is like the top part of your head, excuse me, is involved in somatosensation, touch and pressure, and also in body awareness, like where you are oriented in space. Here's an example of how a drug affects the parietal lobe. So cocaine can affect this area, and once it does, it makes a person have like attention deficit, so they just can't focus at all, and it interferes with their working memory. The occipital lobe is in the back of the brain, so like where your ears are, but behind them. And this is mainly involved in the visual processing area of the brain. It's involved in processing distance, depth, perception, color, and face recognition, but mostly people know this center for vision. And so all of your visual information that you get first goes to the occipital lobe to process that information that you're seeing. And of course, some drugs affect that too, such as alcohol can impair your vision. The temporal lobe is a section that is right above the ears and next to the ears. I believe that's a common place in which, for boxers, that's where you get punched and you can get knocked out. I don't know if that's an illegal hit or not, but that's a place where you can get knocked out. And so that area of the brain is involved in auditory information. So auditory means sound, what you hear. Also in facial recognition and memory. All right, so this wraps up all of the information that I want you to know for the brain anatomy. And on the next PowerPoint, we are going to learn about the actual brain cells and what goes on inside of the brain cells and how drugs affect them. So I'll see you in the next lecture.